We tell them where to drive. We tell them where to go. We don't need to gamify anything. We don't need to have very weird pricing incentives and cost incentives and just take out the whole gamification. You're able to just run a business the way it's supposed to be run, which is as efficiently as possible.
We are talking with the co-founder and CEO of Revel, and that's a company that is aiming to electrify cities' transportation through EV charging hubs, mopeds, e-bikes, and all-electric Tesla-powered ride-sharing. And then we're going to find out more about sourcing materials that make a key component of EVs, and that is batteries, and how the impending lithium shortage could affect the EV market. And that conversation is with Morning Brew's emerging tech reporter, Grace Donnelly. We love Morning Brew collabs with our reporters, our friends. So this is great. Thanks. So Grace, you've done some deep reporting on the batteries that power electric vehicles. So let's start with what is contributing to the demand for electric vehicle batteries. And as you stated in your reporting, by the year 2030, more than 27 million electric vehicles are expected to be on the roads. Electric vehicle purchases could make up 20 to 30% of all vehicle sales. So what exactly is driving this demand, and how does competition among automakers contribute to this skyrocketing demand?
Right. Well, I mean, transportation is such a big contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. And so, in trying to address climate change, we're trying to electrify transportation. And so, you have both, the federal government in the US saying now with the Biden administration that they want to aim for 50% of all new passenger vehicle sales to be electric by 2030. And you also have automakers who are recognizing that this is the direction things are going in and are making really, really big investments to try and own that EV market.
How much is the government's role playing in this? I know there was a lot of promise coming in, especially in the campaign. This is going to be a green administration. There's going to be a major push to, reduce climate change, and part of that is a definite, support, I guess, or maybe not a subsidy necessarily, but certainly a push to the consumer side, to companies to go. What is their role right now?
Yeah, so I think some of it is happening and some of it remains to be seen. There's some provisions in the bipartisan infrastructure bill that's already been signed into law that relate to electric vehicles. There's $7.5 billion in funding for charging infrastructure. So that will roll out and create, new charging stations that will help address that range anxiety that a lot of folks have when they're thinking about switching to an electric vehicle. But some of the other climate provisions were really tied up in the Build Back Better bill, and so the fate of that is still up in the air. So there's a lot more that could come, but I think there are some steps in leadership that you're seeing from this administration where they're talking about electrifying public fleets, the USPS vehicles, and trying to lead by example, I guess, there in getting more electric vehicles into their fleets.
And a lot of these plans on investments, to your point, are tied up in political debates and negotiations, and that contributes to the US maybe being a little bit behind compared to other regions. Asia, for example, is leading in battery production. Just three companies making up almost 70% of the EV battery manufacturing market. That's China's CATL, South Korea's LG Energy Solution, and Japan's Panasonic. From your reporting, what have you found has contributed to Asia's dominance in this space over the US?
Yeah, so they've been working on the battery supply chain in Asia, building that up and the infrastructure for manufacturing over the last 10, 15 years. And I mean, even going back to the 1990s, there was a need to build batteries for consumer electronics, for digital cameras, for everything, since then smartphones. And so they've been able to scale up, the processes for raw materials, for manufacturing. And at this point, they're just way out ahead of anybody else in producing EV batteries. I mean, about almost 3/4 of all EV batteries are manufactured in China at this point.
Where does the U.S. fit into that? I know a lot of American manufacturers are working with those major players in the industry in Asia, but are there homegrown talents here that are working on battery production?
So, I mean, the US is way behind in battery production capacity. And yeah, I mean, most of the large auto manufacturers who are trying to build, battery factories, they're choosing to team up with companies like LG, with SK Innovation, these Asian companies, and using their expertise in joint ventures mostly to create, battery production capacity here in the US.
So Frank, thank you for joining us on the show.
Nora, thanks for having me.
So Revel is trying to electrify mobility in cities across the US, and that includes New York City, DC, San Francisco. And your website states, we're not talking about 2030. Our products are 100% electric today, which not a lot of companies can say at this point. What inspired you to start the company in the first place?
Yeah, it's a great question, Nora. When you talk about the inspiration for this company, I think you have to go back to when I first moved to New York after college. And my professional background is a little different, I think, from a lot of entrepreneurs or CEOs. I actually worked as a chef for about 5 years in New York City restaurants around 2007 to about 2012. And I lived in far out neighborhoods in Brooklyn and Queens. And every single day I'd hop on my bike and bike 6, 8, 10 miles to work in Manhattan, and then bike back at 1, 2 in the morning. And really just getting around this city, the best way to get around a big, complicated city like New York is on 2 wheels. It's just fantastic. So that sort of love of moving around a city on 2 wheels is what sort of sparked the inspiration for Revel. And also just traveling overseas and seeing mopeds as a sort of vehicle form factor so popular in so many countries, rich, poor, doesn't matter. And just thinking, why is this vehicle type not in a city like New York? So sort of just the love of things on 2 wheels, traveling, seeing mopeds so many other places. That's what inspired Revel in 2018. Obviously, the company has grown since then.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, it's pretty popular as a form of transportation in other places, European cities, South American cities, but there is still this safety concern in very dense cities like New York City, for example. How do you sort of change that psychology for consumers who might be worried to try out a moped in a big city for the first time here in the US?
Yeah, so I mean, when it comes to moped safety, before anyone can get on one of our mopeds in any of our markets, you have to go through a pretty lengthy safety training. Really teaches you how to ride the vehicle, what to be looking out for when you ride a vehicle like this. Before any time you step on one of our mopeds, every single time you ride, you also take what we call a helmet selfie. So just proving to us that you are wearing that helmet is on your head before you ride. And I think it's really interesting, since Revel formed, what we're really doing too with the moped product is really just trying to change car culture. So many cities in the US are so car dependent. And it's really nice to offer an option, whether it's New York, San Francisco, DC, Miami, offer the residents in these cities a really just easy, lightweight, environmental friendly way to get around, and a fun way to get around.
The helmet selfie thing is cool to think about. You also have some other cool tech like automatic detection when riders travel the wrong way or they're in prohibited zones. Is there any plan to expand the usage of that kind of technology, maybe licensing out to other mobility companies? Seem like there's broad use for that kind of tech.
I would say there's no commercial plans right now, as you mentioned, but it's something we're always working to improve and refine. And our data science team here is constantly thinking about how to update it and be on sort of the cutting edge when it comes to that technology. There's no question.
So during the pandemic, obviously a lot of changes to people's commutes and where and how we work. Did the pandemic change any of the trends that you saw for consumers maybe opting to use mopeds when they otherwise wouldn't have?
Absolutely. Both our moped product and our rideshare product now really is the perfect indicator for where we are in the COVID cycle. I'll just put it that way. If you think about the last 2 years, we've had almost 3 COVID lockdowns now. And our ridership, both on mopeds and rideshare, tracks exactly to how that lockdown is going. So if you take 2020, for example, from March to May of 2020, yeah, ridership fell off a cliff, revenue fell off a cliff. But then sort of you saw that rebound starting in May, and then definitely once cities really started to open up in June of 2020, you saw a massive amount of ridership across all of our markets. You take rideshare, which we launched in August of 2021, this past summer. you had really exceptional ridership along with the moped business. And then around December 15th, you saw a dip. And I would say around January 15th, you really started to see ridership come back. So again, sort of tracking COVID in real time, just look at our data.
And you are looking towards a larger mission in that you're not just trying to provide mobility through your company, but also trying to make electric vehicles and electric transportation more accessible to consumers overall. So you've spoken in past interviews about this chicken and egg problem, where maybe consumers are hesitant to buy an electric vehicle because the infrastructure, the charging stations aren't quite there yet. What is the solution to this chicken and egg problem?
So the chicken and egg problem to listeners out there, it's really there's no EV infrastructure, so there's no EVs. And there's no EVs, so there's no EV infrastructure. It is a very simple, elegant problem that everyone has been trying to solve for over a decade now for those that have been in the electric vehicle industry, right? The way we're solving that is bringing the whole platform at the same time. So I am building publicly available EV infrastructure at scale in cities like New York. Our first site in Bed-Stuy is the largest in the country when it comes to an EV charging site, and we have many more behind it that will be launching in 2022 and beyond. And we are building these sites, and guess what? We're pairing it with our mobility side of the business. So our rideshare business will scale alongside of it and provide that demand to that site. That allows us to build now, allows us to go get financing from folks like BlackRock and Toyota to build these sites, because we're bringing the demand from our own business to those sites. So we're kind of solving the chicken and the egg problem by just doing it all at once, instead of being like so many companies talking about what they're going to accomplish by 2030. Well, I can tell you what we're going to accomplish now in 2022 when it comes to driving EV adoption in cities.
So you were mentioning how Revel has a partnership with Tesla and all Tesla fleet for ride sharing. How did this relationship form in the first place, and why Tesla?
So just to be super clear, listeners, we do not have any sort of strategic partnership with Tesla, but we do use Tesla vehicles for our rideshare fleet. That relationship started through, I think it was an investor contact, and then you get connected to the sales folks at Tesla. I think the more important question, Nora, I think you're trying to get at is why did you use Tesla? For us right now, Tesla is the leader. I think that's pretty clear from battery technology, battery range, price point, brand. They're the leader. So we're going to continue to use Tesla, probably through 2022. But there are a lot of car companies, as you know, that are hot on their heels and delivering a lot of models in the years ahead here.
So that does sound like it's part of the plan then, is maybe even traditional automakers who are getting more into EVs?
Folks like Toyota are on our board. Folks like Hyundai are also an investor. So it's obviously a conversation we're having. But at the end of the day, we're going to make a decision moving forward that's based on those criteria I mentioned: brand, battery technology, battery range, and price. And we're constantly going to be surveying the market for what's the best out there.
One of the very interesting things about your model is that rather than relying on the gig economy, like a lot of other rideshare companies, Revel plans to hire drivers or has full-time drivers. Other rideshare companies have opted for this as well. Some of the newer ones like Alto, for example. Curious to hear what is your strategy behind that.
I think outside of strategy, just putting that to a side for a second, from the day we started this company in 2018 on the moped side of the business, we've never used the gig economy. I've never employed gig workers. We've always had W-2 employees, swapping batteries in that fleet as mechanics. I think it's just a core philosophy of this company that you want to employ the residents of the city that you're operating in. So that was just something we've always had from day one. I think when it comes to the rideshare system, I think it gives us a big advantage. Now we're talking strategy piece of this. The incumbents right now that do rideshare, they're always trying to, I'll just say, gamify drivers because they're not an employee. And it's almost a constant tension between the driver and the incumbent rideshare business. For us, drivers are employed. We tell them where to drive. We tell them where to go. We don't need to gamify anything. We don't need to have very weird pricing incentives and cost incentives and just take out the whole gamification. You're able to just run a business the way it's supposed to be run, which is as efficiently as possible. And when you control your own fleet, you control the vehicle, you control the infrastructure, you control the car, that opens up a lot of efficiencies that the incumbents don't have.
This gamification, though, is what got the Ubers and Lyfts on the map. I'm curious, was there any particular experience that you had or conversations with drivers that you had that sparked this decision to hire drivers full time versus contract?
I think when you talk to drivers, and I've talked to a lot, especially as we've gone into this business, um, there actually is no perfect model, maybe, right? Some drivers do really appreciate that flexibility. But you know what? A lot of drivers really like the employee model. We have not had trouble hiring. A lot of drivers really appreciate that if they get a flat tire in their shift, they're still going to get paid that day. And they're not going to be on the hook for that vehicle maintenance. So not one employment model is going to be perfect for everybody, but I can tell you there are a lot of folks in New York City that want to drive for Revel because they're not on the hook for any vehicle maintenance, any electricity costs, any insurance costs. They get into an accident, God forbid, they just come and drive as an employee. So I'll just say that.
And looking at the apply to be a driver's page on your website, there's a lot of incentives there. There's paid time off, access to health insurance, paid for hours behind the wheel, not by number of rides given, and drivers receiving 100% of tips. But then if you look at Uber, part of their argument to use contract workers is because it allows them to keep prices lower for customers. And also they claim that drivers like the flexibility of contract work. So my overall question here is, how do you keep drivers happy and give them what they need while also keeping prices reasonable for your customers?
The way we've set up pay also has incentives as well. So depending on the shift, the day of the week, obviously more drivers want to go to drive Monday than they do Sunday. So guess what? We pay more on Sunday. So we set up our pay also to incentivize drivers for what the business needs at the end of the day. So for us, something to realize as well, this model is not going to be taken to, I'll just call them, tier 2, tier 3 cities in the US. I'm sure you've experienced it yourself. You travel to a smaller city in the South or the Midwest, and you take a 30-minute ride with one of the incumbents, and it's like $12. That is not reality. There is not rational pricing. That is not a business. This works in major urban markets, like in New York, where the pricing is rational, where the incumbents are very profitable. This is a very real business. So I would say it's also just being real with ourselves that this model that we have, this vertically integrated model, works really well, but not everywhere.
It's good to admit that. We appreciate that. Yeah. So looking ahead a little bit to the future, you did mention you may plan to offer non-Tesla vehicles in your fleet, but within Tesla, they're testing out things like full self-driving. They're out in beta now for certain customers to use. What is your outlook overall on self-driving cars? And is this part of the plan down the line for Revel's fleet?
So right now, considering we are focused on the biggest, most dense urban markets, right? Autonomous vehicles, no matter who you talk to, when you're talking the biggest, densest, most urban markets, it's going to be some time before they get here. I mean, just walk outside in a city like New York. Can you imagine autonomous vehicles anytime soon? So I think right now, our entire business, our entire strategy, the way we plan for the future is drivers are going to be driving our vehicles. Do I think autonomous will come quicker to, long haul trucking and fixed routes? Yes, of course. But for our business, urban markets, dense cities, it's not coming anytime soon.
Certainly a lot of regulatory hurdles to get over when we talk about self-driving, but also just for mopeds and for ride sharing generally, a lot of regulation around it. And you've been pretty vocal about working with city officials to ask for permission rather than asking for forgiveness. So what does compliance look like? What does that conversation look like with city officials for you?
Yeah, this has been a core tenet of how we operate from day one as well. So even just to go back in time again to 2018, when it was me and my co-founder, and we're trying to launch 68 mopeds in Bushwick and Greenpoint and Williamsburg, I had a direct line to New York City DOT, and I made sure they knew who I was and what we were doing, and I had essentially their verbal permission. We were talking to New York City Council members of those districts. One of them even came to our press conference of that launch back in 2018 to support us. So even as two co-founders launching this business in 2018, we knew to be successful, you needed government on your side. You needed policymakers on your side. You needed community on your side. It's just the right way to run a business. And we've tried to have that ethos moving forward for the last 4 years. As we've scaled the moped business, we've never launched somewhere without permission. Look at all the markets we're in: San Francisco, Miami, DC. We are permitted there, and we did not launch till we were permitted. So it's a very simple thing, but I think it's really important. And it also sets the tone for the relationship with that city, which I think for us is a really good relationship across all of our markets.
That is ethically very sound and seems like the right way to do things, but maybe a little antithetical to how big tech tends to operate. They do a thing and then regulation catches up to them. Do you think this may slow down innovation to some extent, or do you think you're saving yourself time and headache by making sure that city officials are okay with your business before you launch anything new?
I think there's also something with your question around how Revel operates, which is a lot of startups that, founders will come to me for maybe advice on how to deal with regulation or politics. And I think something I've noticed is a lot of startups look at regulation in a closed sort of room, and they just look at regulation. And they don't realize that regulation is so influenced by politics. And before you even walk into a room with a regulator, you have that initial conversation, third conversation, whatever it is, you better understand the politics behind the scenes. You better understand who actually has the power behind the scenes before you walk into that room and have that conversation. I think that's just something Revel has understood pretty well in order to get these permits and work with the regulator and get them to work with us. Is before you walk into the room with that regulator, is you understood what the political dynamics were behind the scenes and you made sure that they were behind you.
If you like what you saw and you like what you heard, you can listen to the entire episode of this podcast, Business Casual, anywhere you get your podcasts. And please go ahead and subscribe to the Morning Brew YouTube channel and go ahead and click on that alarm bell, that thing right there, so you can be alerted anytime there's a new video.